I'm Rachel White. Welcome to New America NYC. We're really lucky to have an event tonight for Rebecca. She's been with the New America Foundation for about a year and a half as a fellow, and the fellows are very much the lifeblood of our institution. They're the R&D, they're the idea generators, and Rebecca came in as a very talented journalist and a great thinker, and with an idea for a book, and it's really a pleasure to celebrate that book tonight. So one final note, if you're tweeting, which I hope you are, please use our hashtag. It's NANYC. Thanks a lot, and welcome, Rebecca and Mark.
Thank you.
So I'm Mark Whitaker. I'm the managing editor of CNN, and you all know Rebecca. She's a fellow at the New America Foundation, still at the Berkman Center at Harvard, or she was there for a while?
Yeah, I was there. Still kind of have a relationship with them, but I'm mainly a fellow at New America Foundation.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say congratulations on this book, because it is really a fascinating book for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet. And for, if there was any question of how profoundly the internet and digital media is changing our world, but also the incredibly complicated issues it raises politically in terms of privacy and governance, the book really captures it and really has a lot of kind of provocative ideas about what everybody needs to do about this going forward. So I want to get into all of that, but first I want to start with how you got interested in this subject to begin with, because I'm now at CNN. Rebecca used to be a CNN correspondent. So tell the story about how you started down this road.
Yeah, well, I guess it started in terms of my interest in the internet and its impact on politics and so on. Really began when I was working for CNN in China, and I was there for basically all of the 90s, from 92 until 2001. And when the commercial internet arrived in China in 1995, I was there and was able to observe how people began to use it and how it was affecting the public discourse, how people were using it to get information out, and how we as journalists were able to use the internet to report in ways that were new. And so then as I went to Tokyo and spent also a lot of time in Korea and observed, there was a citizen media organization called Oh My News, which some of you may have heard of, which was responsible for a former president of South Korea, Roh Moo-hyun, being elected basically, and by a very narrow margin. It was basically his fans on that website who mobilized the vote, and that was the first time that really you had a president who was elected thanks to the internet. And I just kind of became increasingly fascinated and began to follow blogs. One of the first bloggers I started following is a Japanese but very international man, Joey Ito, who had a blog and was linking to bloggers around the world who were writing things about what was happening in their country that I thought gave a perspective that was different from what we, the mainstream media, were reporting. And Iraqi bloggers talking about what was happening in their country, and this authenticity of voice and the ability to have a conversation with your audience rather than just kind of a lecture, I thought was fascinating. And so anyway, I ended up going on leave in 2004 to Harvard, to the Shorenstein Center on Press and Public Policy, and started blogging, began to kind of experiment with the use of social media and journalism. Then went to the Berkman Center, ended up not going back to CNN, which is another long story, but anyway.
We'll talk about that.
Went to the Berkman Center for Internet Society. Yeah. And founded an international bloggers network, co-founded with a colleague named Ethan Zuckerman, who's now at MIT. We co-founded a citizen media site called Global Voices, which kind of aggregates bloggers around the world and tries to provide a platform for people to be heard. And so I began to really become concerned and kind of watching firsthand as people who were trying to speak out from different parts of the world, encountering censorship, encountering surveillance, getting jailed, and kind of looking at the global trends, with the internet being a liberating force, but also a lot of challenges. And with the whole case, in China, with dissidents' information being handed over to the Chinese government by Yahoo, and then Google going into China and deciding to censor some of his search results, and so on, I became interested in the role that companies play in kind of mediating people's relationship with governments, and how sometimes they play an empowering role, but sometimes they enable an extension of government power in ways that can be quite insidious. And so, to make a long story short, I eventually felt that there were various iterations of how I was going to approach this subject, but really felt that I needed to write a book that explained how, as a journalist, I had come to understand the way in which the internet is affecting our freedoms and potentially affecting our political future, both for good and bad, and what this means for us as citizens and what we can do. And how we can affect the change. And my conclusion, really, and my message is that as citizens, we're increasingly dependent on these digital platforms and services for all aspects of our lives, including our political lives. But the way in which the internet evolves is not some kind of given inevitability. It depends on the decisions of human beings who are running the companies. It depends on the legislators who are regulating the internet, and it depends on citizens who are using the internet to push it in different directions. And so it really depends on whether we engage in this space and push to ensure that the internet evolves in a manner that's compatible with democracy and other values that we cherish, because it could, but it also doesn't have to.
Right. So let's talk about China, which is a case study that you look at very closely in the book, of both sides of this. I mean, on the one hand, the way in which the internet and digital media and now social media have kind of empowered dissidents and people who sort of want to become more involved in the political process, but also, as you mentioned, how governments can also use it as a tool of surveillance, sometimes of repression. Talk about how that's worked on both sides in China.
Yeah, so my chapter on China is really about how China is Exhibit A for how an authoritarian government evolves and survives in the internet age. So I use a term, networked authoritarianism, to describe this kind of new kind of authoritarianism that I think China represents. And China, of course, wants to be part of the world. It wants to be a global economic power. It can't cut itself off. It can't try to control people 100%. If it does that, it'll be North Korea. And for lots of good reasons, China doesn't want to be North Korea. So they have to allow connectivity with the world. They have to allow creativity to flow, for people to travel, but also to use the education for communication, education, and all kinds of other things. But at the same time, they want to make sure that the Communist Party remains in power. And at the moment, they've managed to navigate that by enabling enough discourse, or allowing enough discourse, that people are able to criticize the railway ministry for being corrupt and resulting in a train crash, or local government officials who end up committing malfeasance and so on, and people are exposing this. But if you really try to organize an opposition party, or write a treatise about why China needs multi-party democracy and how to go about it, you go to jail as usual. That you have no more rights to do that than you ever did. And people who sign on to petitions, get little visits from the police and this type of thing. So far, people are feeling freer than they ever did before. They're able to talk about more things and have more choices than ever before. Yet at the same time, the Communist Party doesn't have to actually change the political structure or the legal structure in order for people to feel like they they have perhaps more of a give and take kind of relationship with the government than they used to.
Mm-hmm. And where does that go, do you think,
Yeah.
going forward? Because, I mean, this is the question with all things regarding
Right.
China, right? Is
Yeah.
the pressure going to build to such a point that either the regime is going to have to change fundamentally, or there's going to be a massive crackdown?
You know, it's my father's a professor of Chinese history, and so he always, one kind of learns that, in the long run, that whatever it is that nobody managed to predict about China is what's going to happen. So, but that said, I think in the short to medium term, my money is on the Communist Party riding things through for quite some time. In the longer term, I think all bets are off. Certainly, I think the internet and people's use of the internet is pushing the government to be more responsive and to improve governance in a lot of different ways. But in a way that kind of can also improve the Communist Party's legitimacy and enable them to kind of continue on. So I think it depends on economically, whether or not a severe crisis happens or whether there's sort of a natural disaster that becomes unmanageable, how certain politicians end up kind of managing going forward, how sophisticated they are about managing, I think, the information flows and the discourse, or how heavy-handed they are. So it's really hard to tell, but I guess the point is that, back in the 90s when I was in China and the internet showed up, all the journalists were just saying, there's no way the Communist Party can survive this. It's just a, decade tops. We said back in '95. And, so it's, the Chinese Communist Party can survive a lot more, I think, than people tend to expect. But then again, there have been a lot of things that happened in the past year that nobody ever imagined. So something could certainly come out of left field.
Now, you talk a lot in the book about how the big internet companies, private internet companies that most of us rely on, when we go on the web, Google, Facebook, et cetera, Microsoft, have empowered us all, but also in some of these cases also become sort of the collaborators, either witting or unwitting. So could talk, because they've been in the news on privacy issues and now with Facebook's IPO, could you talk specifically about Google and Facebook and your view of the role, the good and the bad that they've done?
Well, with Facebook, again, this platform has been tremendously useful to a lot of activists in many countries, and we saw that in Egypt, we saw that in Tunisia, that people were able to use it to organize and to spread information about, here's where the protest is going to be, and here's some articles about awful things that the police did, and some evidence, and spread this to your friends, and so these types of social media platforms that kind of everybody was on originally just to kind of socialize, suddenly can become politically very effective, but. Facebook has, it makes some kind of governance choices, for lack of a better word, in terms of how its terms of service are structured, how its privacy policies are structured, that can make activists quite vulnerable. So they require that people use their real name. And if you're not using your real name, you can have your account deactivated. And so this has happened to activists at times, at critical times when they were in the middle of organizing things. Also, the privacy policies have changed suddenly at different points in ways that have exposed people's friends' networks. In 2009, Facebook made a sudden change to its privacy policies where, one day your friend's network was a private matter, and then the next day suddenly it was exposed publicly, and people didn't have a chance to change their settings before your entire network was exposed. And if you're an Iranian activist and the police are trying to hunt down all your associates, that's highly uncool. And so, so there are a lot of business choices that these platforms make that might make a lot of sense in terms of maximizing advertising and the commercial value of the platform, but for the most vulnerable users, and not only activists in the Middle East or elsewhere, but also just people who don't want their sexual preference known to their boss, or their political views known to their colleagues or something. It can be really unpleasant, and has a real effect on our ability to conduct discourse if a lot of the campaigning and activism that's going on has moved into these spaces. And with Google, Google has made kind of more public and overt commitments to core principles on free expression and privacy, and they've joined this organization that I and Bennett Freeman here and a few other people who are here today were involved with setting up the Global Network Initiative, which is trying to get companies to kind of sign on to core principles on free expression and privacy. And Google signed up to this and agreed to be held accountable, and as a result is now publishing data on how many requests they're getting from different governments to hand over information, information about when they're taking things down and what governments are requesting that, and so on. So they're trying to be more transparent. And Facebook, to its credit, has also, because a lot of activists have been pushing them to be more clear with users about their policies, they are making an effort to be more clear. But definitely, I mean, Google just the other day changed their privacy policies and kind of unified them, and a lot of activists are still trying to figure out what this means.
Yeah, what does it mean?
Yeah,
help us out.
I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what it means.
Right.
I mean, literally it means that rather than all their services having separate privacy policies, it's all been turned into one big privacy policy, the same policy across all their services, but also that the data is shared between the services. So, kind of YouTube and what you're doing on YouTube and what you're doing on Gmail is sort of now kind of within the company now kind of uniformly handled. Now, what that means in terms of what gets handed over to governments and that kind of thing, Google says that doesn't change, and they're still kind of being in terms of their transparency and their commitment and so on. But people are just concerned about the more data that's being collected, then what can happen to it and how it gets accessed, and when it's aggregated, between sort of what you're doing on YouTube and what you're doing on Gmail, and if that's kind of combined in their own databases and kind of patterns are created, could that get misused in different ways that are hard to predict, or and unintended perhaps. And so at this point we don't know, and actually within Global Voices, this community that I co-founded and am still involved with, we're kind of having a discussion about do we stay on Google Groups or not, and we haven't made a decision about how we're going to handle it. We're probably going to have to invite some Google people to come answer some questions from our community before we can even make a decision. So, yeah, it's difficult, and part of the issue is when these decisions are being made, are the companies kind of performing sufficient kind of assessment of what are the implications in terms of the human rights of the most vulnerable users. So,
can we trust the cloud? And isn't like cloud a funny word for something we're supposed to trust?
Yeah, well,
sounds like something's going to rain on you, right?
The problem with this word, the cloud, it kind of gives you the impression that your data is just kind of floating around in the ether, and it's completely untethered. But of course, data is all on computer servers that are physically somewhere. And with the exception of a few experiments to have, computer servers on floating ships, or, creating man-made islands in the middle of the sea, and there's some people who are trying to create sort of non-jurisdictional, computer hosting services. But, most stuff that's in the cloud is actually, in somebody's jurisdiction that has laws, that has criminal investigations, and the company that's hosting that data is, of course, subject to that jurisdiction, and whatever the laws happen to be. And so, yeah, it gets very, very complicated very quickly. In terms of both privacy laws and data retention laws, and then, you know, law enforcement kind of access to data and so on. And so, yeah, it's not really in the cloud, it's just kind of in a distributed.
Right. So you talk a lot in the book about the need and the desirability for sort of alternative networks. So that if you're, you know, a dissident or even just an ordinary citizen, you don't have to rely on necessarily. You may still use, you know, all of the big services, but that if you don't want to, or you're worried about your privacy or whatever, there are alternatives. And this is one of the things when you talk about being a netizen, it's a term she coins here, sort of an engaged citizen who's actually, you know, trying to sort of play a role in how this all evolves. How realistic is that? I mean,
well, you know, it's difficult, and there are quite a number of groups.
And talk as you talk about it. Give some specifics of people who have succeeded.
Sure.
You know, what does an alternative network look like?
Yeah. So for instance, there's an alternative to Twitter called Diaspora. Well, actually, the alternative to Facebook is Diaspora. I'm sorry. The alternative to Twitter is called Identica, which not too many people have heard of, but I imagine there may be some people in this room who use these things. But so, for instance, Identica is trying to be distributed and kind of open source, and Diaspora is again meant to be sort of more privacy-focused alternative to Facebook. That's again open source, and there's a project called Freedom Box. That's the idea is that people can have their own kind of servers at home where they kind of host their data and they don't have to go through the big commercial networks. And so people are experimenting with this, and definitely people who feel that they have serious privacy concerns are working on ways to, you know, host their data on their, you know, you buy your own server, you host it yourself. But it's difficult to scale because, partially just because of security problems. So running your own email server as opposed to using Gmail or some big commercial cloud service, you really have to have some pretty high, you know, some pretty skilled people just to kind of keep it running and keep it from getting attacked. Or if you're going to host your own websites.
It's almost like living off the grid or something.
Yeah, if you're going to host your own website, rather than relying on, you know, Amazon hosting or, you know, some other hosting service that's commercial, again, you really have to know what you're doing technically, and you have to have some people working with you who really have the technical chops to fend off attacks, you know, because the hacking has become, you know, and activists get hacked by governments a lot. So it's very difficult, and so there are small-scale projects that work kind of for, you know, smaller groups, but a lot of larger projects, you know, a lot of these projects have yet to scale. There are, you know, open source. One of the of course, most successful, more open source, non-commercial projects has been Firefox, which is an alternative browser that seeks to be more secure and it's community maintained and so on. Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult not to be reliant, at least at some level, you know, whether it's your internet service provider or something, on some commercial services, which is why the corporate responsibility piece is so important, which is, you know, you can say, okay, I'm just going to kind of create this independent place where we're just not going to rely on anything corporate, and we're going to kind of keep it free of government interference by just kind of being off, you know, off to the side here, and being very robust with our security. But it's very hard to function that way for any long period of time. You end up needing to use commercial services, and you end up, if you want to have a large community, people who are just naturally using commercial services. And so if the corporations are not committed to basic rights of their users, you're going to have a problem. And this is why it's so important to have internet and telecommunications companies recognizing and committing to the fact that they have responsibilities in this regard. They may not have set out to have responsibilities in this regard. They may have set out hoping to avoid having to deal with these issues. But the matter of fact is that they are hosting the public square. And politically, they're having an impact on our political futures, whether they like it or not. And so they have responsibilities.
So we've had this big public battle in the last few weeks over the Stop Online Privacy Act between the sort of old line media companies on the one hand, which argue that they're creating this original content that needs to be sort of protected, and the big internet companies, which are arguing that what they're proposing would sort of inhibit everybody's freedom to use the web. Now, was this David versus Goliath, or was this Goliath versus Goliath? And what is the answer to how you protect intellectual property in this age?
Neil Young had an interview in the Wall Street Journal this morning, or on one of the blogs, and I recommend that everybody read that, in which he kind of came out and said, yeah, the studios are great and we really need them because they promote our content and develop artists, but at the same time they've failed to evolve, and that sampling online is the new radio, and that's how people find out about music. But on the other hand, the quality of digital audio is really awful, and the studios should be innovating more to provide us with high quality audio that we can then purchase for money, and consider the electronic copies to be kind of inferior. And that there are other ways for studios and music companies to innovate, and they've failed to innovate, and they need to do it because this kind of SOPA versus versus file sharing is kind of a false choice. And so anyway, to come back to this SOPA, to have answered your second question first, there are a number of issues here. I mean, this particular battle between the traditional content, movie and music and entertainment companies on the one hand, and then you had the internet companies who felt that their business model was at risk because the requirements that SOPA would create would basically make internet companies liable for what their users were doing, and force internet companies to proactively monitor their users just in case they're committing copyright violations, and to censor proactively their users. And the internet companies were like, we can't run a business this way, and plus it's violating freedom of speech. And this kind of aligned very well with the activists and the free expression community, and the bloggers and people who are not commercial, who were concerned that this was going to have serious collateral damage on free expression, and those interests aligned. And I mean, there was a bit of Goliath versus Goliath, but if it hadn't been for the grassroots internet users really waking up and saying, oh, wow, how did this bill get this far in Congress, and what the heck's going on over there in Washington, and this makes absolutely no sense. and other people in Washington saying, hello, this is how Washington always is, people, wake up and, get involved. And so I think there has been a bit of a public awakening, realizing that people need to pay more attention to this. And there also has been, I think, a situation where copyright law and quite a lot of internet regulations have been kind of written by special interests or certain lobbies without a lot of public discussion or attention paid. Very little attention paid to how different Congress people are voting on these issues, and I think that's going to change. And But I think on a lot of internet issues, I think the grassroots and the companies won't always be so well aligned. You know, for instance, on surveillance and privacy issues, I think it's going to be more complicated. But I think we have seen an awakening of the public, and particularly of a generation of people in their 20s and 30s who've really kind of grown up with the internet, who are like, wait a minute, you know, this is something we really care about, and I think you're going to start seeing more activism that's going to be more sustained on these issues. But you know, certainly I think as well, some of these internet companies, I mean, it's convenient when you can align your brand with free expression. Yeah. So why not? You know, it was kind of everybody's interests were aligned in this particular case.
Well, they definitely won round one in the PR war.
Yeah.
On that one. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience, but before that, WikiLeaks. What are the what do we take? You know, I mean, who knows whether it's over and Assange is going to go away or not? But what so far from what we've seen in the WikiLeaks story, what are the lessons of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the WikiLeaks story is, you know, one of those, is so complex. You kind of have to pick apart each piece and like kind of take each strand separately. And you know. Julian Assange is kind of an interesting character and a bit of an egomaniac and so on. And, you know, so there's that piece about sort of the Julian Assange kind of drama. But there's just kind of, then there's kind of the issue of how did the US government manage its own classified information and mismanage it. You know, I mean, what happened really is that this private who should not have been deployed in the first place, whose doctor said he's not psychologically sound to be deployed, got deployed. Then he's put in a facility that doesn't adhere to security standards, that's allowing people to, you know, walk in and out with, you know, DVDs, and, you know, was not secured the way it was supposed to. And, you know, enabling these low-level people to have access to State Department cables. I mean, it was just kind of, there's a lot of mismanagement of data and security within kind of the US government networks. And, you know, so there were issues. Did Manning commit a crime? I think, you know, he did. Is his case being handled well? You know, well, we can have a whole other discussion about that. WikiLeaks itself, then there's the whole issue of WikiLeaks' right to publish. I think there's a pretty clear case that in terms of what WikiLeaks did, that it's First Amendment protected speech. And you might, you know, you can deal with prosecuting a crime, fine, but there were a number of things I wrote about in the book concerning WikiLeaks that I think really raised red flags, and one of them had to do with, so WikiLeaks purchased space, you know, web hosting space on Amazon web hosting. After it was attacked on its server in Sweden, they moved to Amazon, and then after the cables were published, you know, there was a lot of reaction, obviously, from Congress, from the State Department, and so on. A lot of statements made, and Amazon just dropped WikiLeaks. You know, Joe Lieberman's office made a phone call over to Amazon complaining, and then suddenly Amazon dropped WikiLeaks as a customer. Now, no charges had been filed against WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks was not guilty as a crime. You could make a very clear case that this was First Amendment protected speech. Yet Amazon made no effort to defend the First Amendment rights of its users, and of course it's not obligated to, right? Because its terms of service says that it can drop you for any reason, you know, and you click agree when you sign up for the service, and so this raises some red flags about companies that we're depending on for controversial speech or you know, to be able to publish controversial speech, which is arguably protected. Dropping controversial speech just because it's controversial is going to create trouble for them, or because maybe it's illegal, but they're not sure, you know, and basically doing this as a result of sort of extra legal threats and posturing on the part of the government rather than any kind of legal due process or anything. And if you have an environment where we're all reliant primarily on these services and all the companies are really afraid of controversy, and so they're going to just drop clients that are going to create problems for them and, you know, cause senators to accuse them of being unpatriotic, you know, where does that take us? That takes us in a very troubling direction. And so that's one of my
So for my
concerns.
friend Steve Fusese and the other lawyers in the audience, summarize what you say in the book about sort of the, you know, the issues you run into in this new age of global communication via the internet and social media across all of these different countries with different privacy and national security laws.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, is that sovereignty is no longer kind of nation state by nation state in a lot of ways. You've got these private sovereignties overlapping, and you've got a situation now where, you know, the United States could pass a law that shapes how Facebook works or how Google works, and that's going to affect internet users in Egypt who had no say in electing the people who passed the law, and, you know, there's nothing they can do about it. And so I deal in the book quite a lot about how the mechanisms that have, you know, nothing's ever perfect, but the mechanisms within democratic society that we've worked out to constrain abuses of power, which we're always struggling to actually make them work properly in a physical democratic nation state, but at least we have a sense of how they should be, right? How you constrain power within a democracy and how you keep abuses in check. Those institutions don't work so well across a globally interconnected world with lots of different kind of nation-state sovereignties and then this interconnected network. And so there ends up being not a very good way to constrain the abuse of power across our digitally networked spaces in a manner that really serves the interests and protects the rights of all internet users across the planet. We haven't worked out how to do that yet. And so I talk about how we're sort of at a Magna Carta moment in a way, where, you know, sort of 800 years ago, you know, the barons of England decided that, you know, maybe this divine right of kings thing isn't working quite as well for us as we would like, and so
I know who educated you about all of that.
And I'm oversimplifying, but yeah, we have a scholar of, anyway. Yeah. You know, and force the king to sign the Magna Carta, and recognizing that, you know, even the sovereign must be constrained by a basic set of laws. And then eventually we kind of moved on to the notion of consent of the governed, and actually came up with a way to, albeit imperfectly, you know, implement the governance by consent as opposed to by monarch. And now we've sort of reached a new moment where we're recognizing that the kind of assumptions about how sovereignty should work and how power should be accountable, or, you know, what makes power legitimate, these assumptions and these structures aren't working particularly well in a globally networked world. And so we've come to that realization, but we're not quite sure what replaces it. And certainly I don't think it's like some big centralized world government or something like that, you know. But you know, what are the distributed mechanisms for keeping power in check, be it private power or state power or power of, hackers who are just better than everybody else, who are, pushing their agenda on everybody, which also happens. Right. How do you constrain the abuse of power in this networked world and ensure that the rights of minorities and unpopular people who are peaceful can be protected? And we don't have good answers. And part of, one of the big reasons why I wrote the book is just to kind of point that out and sort of call for everybody to start working on answers. And I think the first step to start working on answers is to kind of recognize what has changed and to be actively engaged in questioning those who are exercising power over our digital lives, and work with one another to come up with new ways to constrain that power.
Well, I think the Magna Carta moment is a good moment to open it up to questions to the audience. So.
I believe the first revelation of WikiLeaks was of an international war crime, which was the helicopter attack on civilians. Is it not in the public good that international law, which is also the law of the land, be upheld and exposed? And also, isn't the WikiLeaks case kind of very different from other leaking activities in that they vetted their documents with a number of mainstream media?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with the helicopter video where the helicopters were gunning down civilians and so on. Again, certainly, if war crimes were committed, that should be dealt with, and I'm certainly not a supporter of not holding people accountable for having killed innocent civilians. But there are a lot of problems. I guess the question is, what do I think should be done specifically?
Is that not in the public good
to expose that
war crimes that are committed?
No, I think it is in the public good. Yeah, and I think it is, and I think it's good that was exposed. And it's definitely true that WikiLeaks, the diplomatic cables, the initial publication of many of them were vetted by, or at least some of them were vetted by journalists, and others kind of came out in different ways. But again, it's really complicated with some of the cables. There's a real question. Some of the cables, you could see how their publication was probably going to help serve the cause of justice somehow. There were other ones that were exposing sources, diplomatic sources, to danger that, again, was more questionable. So I think with WikiLeaks, again, you kind of have to take it case by case, cable by cable. And I think this kind of leaking is going to probably happen in the future again, although maybe not on the same scale. I think it's really complicated. And as I said, WikiLeaks, their publication of this material is, I think, constitutionally protected speech. Now, in terms of the details of the publication of specific material in what specific context, I think you have to look at each situation in its own case. I think WikiLeaks had some good effects, some bad effects, frankly. And actually, though, with WikiLeaks, the helicopters hack was not their first act. That before they did that video leak and then the cables leak, they actually for several years were releasing a lot of other documents. So actually the first draft, an early draft of something called the the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Act, which was being negotiated in secret and was kind of in its early draft sort of worse than SOPA in terms of what it was going to require internet service providers to do globally. A trade agreement that the United States was negotiating in secret, and WikiLeaks obtained a copy from a European negotiating delegation and published this publicly. And they were also involved in publishing documents from quite a lot of different governments and exposing a lot of wrongdoing, and that this was kind of, sort of the next thing that they did.
Although their motives, remember, I mean, Assange is basically on record as essentially saying, that his motive actually was to get governments to crack down. I mean, he sort of had as much of an anarchist agenda as he had.
There was certainly,
right to know.
I think that was part of it, and he, his. I think he did not. He was not in the position of, I'm exposing information so that the United States can improve itself. It was that I want to, he's on record in his essay saying I'm out to destroy the United States government, which, I think different people in this room will differ as to whether that's necessarily the most helpful approach, but. I mean, all governments are really complex, and frankly, I mean, I know a lot of people in the State Department, and there are a lot of very good people who are really trying to push a human rights agenda. The U.S. government is a very complex thing, and I know people personally who got out of jail as the result of some very tough work that American diplomats did in several different countries. And so to say that all of these people just kind of deserve to be trashed and they're not doing anything good and they're completely illegitimate, I think I disagree with that strongly. And to expose these diplomats and to expose their sources, I don't think that's doing anybody any good. Is the U.S. government hypocritical? Sure. All governments are. Are there some really bad people in our government? Sure. But again, there's definitely a motive that was not sort of objective necessarily. It was definitely a motive to achieve a certain end, and it is true that in talking to people in the State Department particularly, I mean, people were very freaked out, and a unit was created to warn sources around the world, and actually to remove some people from certain countries because they felt they'd been endangered by the cables, and a lot of hand-wringing and effort was made to kind of save lives that were put in danger as a result of the cables being out there. And I think that's really important to recognize, and that's not talked about on the record a great deal because they can't. But I've kind of had some difficult conversations with people in the State Department about how the U.S. government reacted to the cables. Because the State Department legal advisor, wrote a memo saying, this is, WikiLeaks is illegal, and so on, and that kind of contributed to Amazon then kind of censoring them and so on. And this was an opinion. This was not, a legal judgment or anything. And people were really freaked out, and I think overreacted. In some cases, and when I pointed out to them, if you overreact and censor WikiLeaks just because WikiLeaks is hurting your sources, you're actually doing exactly what Assange wanted you to do. And people were like, oh, no. So it's really tough. It's a really tough situation. I mean, and I know activists in Tunisia who found WikiLeaks really helpful in bringing down the Ben Ali regime, and are really glad that those cables came out. So it's a really complicated ethical situation that's not black and white, and is kind of troubling on all sides. And I've certainly struggled with the WikiLeaks case and struggled to figure out kind of what I thought of it at different times. But actually, just final word on that. But Mika Sifry, who runs the Personal Democracy Forum and Tech President, he's not here today, but I think some of his colleagues are, kind of put it, I thought, really well when he said, I'm not sure if I'm pro WikiLeaks or not, but I know that I'm anti-WikiLeaks. Which is that, I'm not sure what I think about WikiLeaks in terms of whether, you kind of almost can't say that it's good or bad because it's kind of everything all at once. But cracking down on WikiLeaks is problematic unless you have due process, and if WikiLeaks is treated with less due process and its right to exist is treated with less rigor just because, Assange is weird and it's a troubling case, I think that's taking us in a very troubling direction.
Yeah, Rebecca, on the topics of sovereignty and free speech.
On the topics of sovereignty and free speech, I wonder if you could just quickly summarize the Twitter censorship issues of the last week or so, and then give your take on that, please.
Ah, yes. Out of the frying pan into the fire. So, yeah. So Twitter made an announcement late last week that that it is setting up a mechanism to basically geo-filter, would be the quasi-technical term, tweets. So what that means is that if a government in a particular jurisdiction gives Twitter a binding court, a legally binding request to take down certain content. So for instance, in the UK, there's some kind of libel case or something, and the court determines that this or according to British law or something, this particular content cannot be seen published in the UK. It's against the law to publish it in the UK, and then makes the request. Then what Twitter does is, rather than remove the content globally, they block it if you're accessing Twitter in the UK, because they can tell from the IP address of your computer or your network what country you're in. And so when you're on Twitter,
so that particular
tweet,
you can't tweet it, or you can't see it.
You can't see it. Okay. So let's say you kind of libel somebody in the UK, and an injunction is brought against you.
Not hard to do under British law.
Yeah, exactly. And an injunction is brought against you, and you've that libelous tweet of yours. Let's say I'm in the UK, and I'm trying to, my Twitter stream, tweets from this guy and this guy and this guy, and your tweets are all in my stream, and your tweet will just appear grayed out, and there will be a message saying this tweet has been blocked in your jurisdiction. And we think you're in the UK, and if you're not actually in the UK,
so you just have to hop on the train and go through the channel and get on in France, and you can see it.
Or you can actually, the secret is that I think Twitter kind of deliberately hasn't clarified very clearly, is that you can also, there's a link you can click and say, well, even though it looks like I'm in the UK from my IP address, I'm not really in the UK, I'm really in Germany. And if you do that, then my understanding is you'd still be able to see the tweet. But so it's not removed globally, but it's removed in the jurisdiction so that they can be technically in compliance with local law, because Twitter is starting to set up offices in lots of different jurisdictions, and they don't want to expose their employees on the ground in different jurisdictions to, liability and potential arrest. You know, we've seen internet companies like, for instance, Google in Italy had a couple of executives that were, you know, convicted of crimes, you know.
Right.
And so talking to, because I've talked to some folks at Twitter about this, and I say,
and don't you think that they had, in some ways, they have a fiduciary responsibility?
That's part of their argument, you know. And so I've talked to some of the people at Twitter. I said, you know, does this mean that if the Chinese government, you know, sends you a court order to block certain tweets by certain Chinese dissidents that you'll comply? And they're like, no. And we're not going to be blocking Syrian dissidents' tweets because, you know, the Syrian government asks us to. That this is really meant to deal with jurisdictional issues in democracies, many of which have narrower, you know, have different approaches to speech. You know, Germany, Nazi speech is banned, you know, and Google has to remove search results to Nazi sites, for instance. And so on. And so that it's meant to deal with that kind of thing. And then they link to, there's a site called Chilling Effects that's meant to kind of promote transparency when governments make takedown requests. And Chilling Effects will host the original documents. So for each tweet that's been blocked, they'll kind of link, you know, here's the government order. And so if you don't like this, take this up with your government. You know, so the idea is to try and be more, you know, the way they're trying to sell it is that they're trying to be more transparent about how they're responding to government requests, and that also they're not actually removing the content, because if, you know, either you can get on the you know, take the tunnel to, you know, or take the train to another jurisdiction, or, you know, there are any number of tools you can use to change your IP address to a different country's IP address, in which case it'll no longer. Or you can tell Twitter that, oh, I'm actually not in the country you think I am. And my understanding is that they'll then act like you're in whatever country you tell them you're in. You know,
wow.
So it seems to me that it's, again, we're going to have to see how they implement it. They have not implemented, they've not blocked anything yet. They've just said they've set up the mechanism to do it. So we have to see how often they do it, under what circumstances. Are they going to be challenging a lot of these requests? You know, to what extent are they going to challenge them? In what countries do they end up doing this? And people are going to be scrutinizing it, I think, really, really closely. But I do, you know, knowing the people there, I do believe them when they say, you know, we're not going to be censoring Chinese tweets or, you know, Egyptian activist tweets and so on. But, you know, we're going to have to be watching really closely.
Right. Twitter hiring lawyers.
Yeah.
So I didn't get that. Twitter doesn't have a specific policy on how it gauges whether or not it complies with government's requests?
Well, my understanding is that, you know, depending on what jurisdiction you're in, the law is different. And so they have lawyers that look at whether, you know, is this request legally binding even in this country? You know, so.
But if you're in China, China's got specific.
Right, but they don't have employees in China, and my understanding is they have no plans to set up an office in China. So therefore, you know, they're going to just not respond to Chinese requests.
They're going to comply with requests from governments where they have offices?
That's my understanding. I mean, they haven't said it like that, and I think one reason why they've said it is because, you know, as the policy rolls out, they don't want to be, you know, kind of held to anything. But you know, we're going to have to see how it. I'm sorry.
That doesn't sound like it's actually stated that
They
comply with local regulations, not we're going to comply with local regulations where
Yeah, so they haven't said it that explicitly, but when you talk to people privately, that's the understanding I'm given. But, you know, again, we're going to have to see how this actually plays out. I mean, you know, if you look at how other companies have handled this, and actually both Facebook and Google comply with a lot of government requests to do the same kind of thing. So like, let's take YouTube. In Thailand, it's illegal to mock the king. And so YouTube has a policy where if the government requests that they block certain videos, they'll block it for people in Thailand, but they won't take it down globally. So if you're in the United States, you can see the material, but if you're in Thailand, you can't. They do not respond to requests from the Chinese government to do anything with their material, because they have no, you know, their servers and so on are, you know, not based there, and they've kind of moved all their content services out of China, and so they're not complying with those types of requests from those types of governments at all. But they are complying with, you know, say also like the Turkish government. You know, it's illegal to make fun of Ataturk, and so, you know, Google ends up blocking YouTube videos or blogs or photos that make fun of Ataturk, but only for Turkey. And they have a notice that comes up that says, you know, in your region or in your country, this video cannot be shown due to local laws and regulations. And so Twitter's actually adjusting its policy to be more similar to what some of the other companies are already doing. And Facebook geo-filters and doesn't really tell people what it's doing. So, yeah, you know, again with Twitter, you know, we've got what they've said on the record. Then we've got what they're kind of telling people off the record and what we're inferring just based on kind of what we know about how that company operates. And we're going to have to see how it goes, you know, because I'm not their spokesperson by any stretch of the imagination. But I think Twitter would also have been better off had they joined something like the Global Network Initiative and be able to say, look, we've made these commitments to free expression and privacy, and we've joined up in this multi-stakeholder initiative where human rights groups are holding us accountable to these commitments and are going to judge us, you know, judge our policies based on these commitments, and sort of be able to have to get more advice and feedback from the human rights community and academics and socially responsible investors and others before they kind of go forward. Because the way they've handled this, they're basically asking everybody to trust them. You know, trust us, we're really trying to do the right thing. But it's like, you know, how do we verify, right? As Ronald Reagan said, you know, I wouldn't have voted for him had I been old enough, but, you know, trust but verify, you know, and that's with companies. I think if they want us to trust them, they have to give us mechanisms to verify that they're really doing what they say, that they really mean it, and that they're really following up on their commitments. And so I think that's what Twitter has to work on now, is give us a means to verify that their intentions are as they say.
So Rebecca will be around to talk to other people who have questions. I just want to say before we wrap it up that you know, to have somebody who has studied this issue as closely as you have, and also who thinks about it and writes about it with such thoughtfulness, not taking anybody's side, I think is a real gift. So I think this is just a terrific kind of starting point for a lot of discussions, and I hope it, you know, is widely read because it deserves to be.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. Actually, before everybody dissipates, just a few
I don't think
words.
anybody's dissipating because there's, you know, a line here.
Yeah. A few words of thanks. I just want to thank the New America Foundation, first of all, for making the book possible, and to Mark for being so generous with your time.
My pleasure.
I know you're incredibly busy these days, and also that there are just a number of people here today who've given me all kinds of support, encouragement, ideas, advice. I'm not sure. I think the Brockmans are no longer here who represent me, but my thanks to them. And T.J. Kelleher from Basic Books was here as well, and just a fabulous editor. And speaking of editors, Bennett Freeman, who's my partner in crime, as it were, has edited several drafts of the thing and read it more times than, and just a lot of people. It's been a long journey. And a lot of people have kind of been on parts of it with me, and it takes a village to write a book. It's, you know, it really is, you know, it's one person's name on the cover, but there are so many people who made it possible for me to synthesize their ideas and draw from their inspiration. That, you know, it's really thanks to everyone who made this possible. So thanks.